Evening, everyone. My name is Jamie Wild. I'm the director of Videoclub. We're an artist, film and video agency based in Brighton. We do national and international projects around film and video and digital culture. We're really pleased to welcome you to Nottingham Contemporary tonight for this screening of Selected 12. As it suggests, it's the 12th year of this programme, and for all of those 12 years we've been coming here to Nottingham Contemporary, so thank you to Nottingham Contemporary for hosting us for a 12th year. The programme is a collaboration with Film London Artist Moving Image Network. We established it in 2011 as part of a sort of a response to and complement to the Film London Jarman Award. So each year we invite the artists who are shortlisted for the Jarman Award to nominate artists who are earlier in their careers. And then from those nominations, we curate a programme which we then tour around the UK. So this is the fourth part of the programme. We've already been in Glasgow, Brighton and London, and next we're off to Cardiff and then Southampton for the close of the programme. If you've got any friends or colleagues who couldn't make it, we are going to be screening the programme online as well at the end of the tour, so that'll happen at the end of November if you want to pass that on to people. Really happy to have April Lynn here, who is the creator of the film Tree, which you'll see at the end of the screening. April's going to be in conversation at the end with Samiir Saunders, and they will have a little chat about April's work, and we'll open that up to a Q&A at the end. That's probably enough from me. Just to say thanks to the Arts Council for funding this programme, and thanks to my colleagues at Film London, and also again thanks to Nottingham Contemporary for hosting us. Enjoy the films, and we'll see you after. Thanks.
Hello everyone, I'm Samiir Saunders, and I'm going to be in conversation with April Lynn, just talking a bit about their film Tree, which is the last film that you just saw there. So yeah, I guess my first question is going to be sort of about the making of the film. I know that you were in conversation with Dr. Nalini Nadkarni, who is an ecologist, on the making of film. Can you tell us a bit about sort of the conversations that went into the film and how that manifested in the film itself?
Yeah, so I was originally approached by Sheffield Docfest because they wanted to support these films. There were collaborations between scientists and artists, and just to see what kind of work that would engender. And I'd had a few scientists whose works I'd followed for a while, and Nalini was one of them. And then a bunch of other people that I had also wanted to work with, they were all unavailable. So it ended up being Nalini, for which I am very, very grateful. And Nalini is based in Utah, in the US. And we would have like regular Skypes and just kind of at first just chat a bit about like the idea. And I was just kind of like, oh, I want to make this more like speculative or like sci-fi, if you will, film about this tree that doesn't really exist, but could exist. And then she was just like, oh, I think she only told me afterwards that she was like, I didn't really know what you meant, but I just like went along with it anyways. So I think over the months we went through like a lot of different processes of, I think her, as she has said it, her unlearning of like a scientific paradigm of truth, of like her being used to only creating knowledge that like has been proven to exist by like the scientific method, and just like allowing herself to participate in something more imaginary and also kind of true in its own right. And for me, I think I almost went the opposite way. Like I've always felt like an affinity to like plants or like vegetal like beings, but I've always avoided referring to them by their like Latin names because I felt that that kind of diminished their beings, or it would be almost like pejorative in a way. And I was like, oh, I would rather know you by like touch or like smell, etc. But then when doing research for this, I had to read a lot of papers on the specific beings that I was kind of working with and whose stories I kind of wanted to tell. And I felt like I unlearned a bit of that kind of, I don't know, distaste, maybe is the right word. Yeah. And I was just like, oh, okay. Yes, this way of classifying and naming and speaking about plants comes with its own kind of more violent history, but actually it's also a gateway to a very specific kind of knowledge, which is also very rich in its own right. So we kind of met in the middle, and had a bit of like a knowledge jam of sorts.
Nice.
Yeah. But yeah, Nalini has a very specific kind of energy as well, which I think is a bit hard to explain if it's not happening in front of you. But sometimes when I'm very excited, I will talk a lot. And then I'll be like, oh my God, I just read this. Da-da-da-da-da-da. This is so amazing. Like, wow, I had no idea. These plants are like so wise and they have really evolved to like grow with their environments in this way. And then Nalini will take that energy and like dial it up like tenfold and come back to me with like, I know, right? Isn't it so amazing? Da-da-da-da-da. And then we would just go like back and forth on these Zoom calls. And at times when we've done Q&As together, it's also very much this similar vibe, and it's kind of wild. Yeah.
That sounds like a really fun energy to be collaborating with. You talked a bit about sort of how you were interested, like you sort of met in the middle with these like with the scientific names versus like the I guess more like managed like sensory like ways of like relating to these beings. Are you quite interested like in approaching knowledge from quite a plural kind of way and sort of like looking at it in a sort of less hierarchical kind of manner?
I think there's a lot of interesting things that can come from like fusing different kinds of perspectives, and I feel like almost that's something that defines my art practice, is this idea of like, or this desire or this intrigue of what might happen if we combine lots of different threads that otherwise are seen as quite separate from each other. So I'm always making things that are like, both speculative and also about like, for instance, speculative about like the climate crisis, also about like how humans can relate to plants differently, and really you could make about 1 billion films on each and one of those things, but I find for me it's nicer to kind of like throw them in like a blender of sorts and see what comes out the other end rather than like specifying in one field.
Yeah.
And sometimes it becomes a bit unruly and hard to manage, but usually it's quite fun. At the end, it's quite easy to say that it's fun.
Yeah. So, like, speaking of sort of like fun and like intimacy and playfulness, like you ended the film there with a provocation to say hi to every tree that you see and to tell them that you treasure them. And I think that, again, like I was saying, it's quite a sort of playful like call to action. Can you tell us a bit more about why you included that and why that might be an important thing to do?
I think so many ways to answer this question, really. I feel like for me quite an important part is kind of bridging this, divide that is constructed between like humans and non-humans or more than humans. And I think in making a work that's about like the climate crisis or about like ecological disaster, I feel like it was really important to kind of, foreground the experiences of this character and have that also be like an invitation to something else. And especially with film, which I think can be quite like a disembodied experience and is can be very head heavy. I kind of wanted to extend, I guess, the world of the film into like the embodied world of the viewer with like something that maybe this character would like them to do in everyday life. Yeah,
kind of making it like sort of very interactive in that kind of way. Is that something
kind of like a campaign film of some sorts, maybe?
Yeah, like literally calling everyone to go and be chill with their trees, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it was something me and Nalini spoke about as well, because I guess she was just like, this film is very political in a sense, just because of the kind of world that we live in now, showing this kind of viewpoint is in a sense more like radical, even though it doesn't necessarily need to be or could be in another way, in another, I guess, society that's dominated by a different way of relating to nature. This might not be that strange. But she was like, this is the world we live in, and like sometimes people, like how overt do you want people to be like, called or like drawn into its mission? Do you want people to kind of like feel their way forward, or do you feel like there needs to be a more clear like instruction for how to take, I guess, this energy forward into everyday life?
Yeah, it feels to me like there was quite a good mix of the clear instruction and also the more felt instruction, because of the way that you sort of really characterized and personified the character of Tree, and just yeah, like can you talk a bit more about, like you were saying, like this like the feeling and this sort of like literal like call to action kind of thing?
This feeling. I knew that I wanted to use animation to kind of tell the story because of the kinds of feelings and textures that I think animation can open up. That like more lens-based film is sometimes hard to do, or it's more tied to reality, right? And I don't know, this feeling is a bit like, I think I've heard a lot of audiences describe it, that they're like kind of scared, or like they think Trees feels very unfamiliar, so they're a bit like put on edge. I don't know if that's the case tonight with everyone here, but they're a bit scared, and I was like, oh, I kind of wanted that lack of familiarity. Like I could have, but like I could have made Tree very like friendly looking and like cuddly and like furry and have like a more anthropomorphic kind of face to be easier to relate to. But I think that distance from like human, or a human viewpoint, or like a human sense of like what's comfortable is something that I think is maybe more interesting, or like in this story feels more fitting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like that's an active, like, radical political choice as well, to sort of have this being that may make us feel uncomfortable because of our distance from them, but also like show the importance of like intimacy and their relation and their history, even though they feel quite different. I know that like quite a few of your previous works, you've been interested, or at least I interpret that you've been interested in intimacy and distance. Yeah, so I wanted to sort of like ask a bit about sort of how this film relates to your previous works. Is there an intention to like to look at the themes of like intimacy and distance and things like that? And do you see this as a progression of that in a way?
Yeah, I think so. That's quite a nice way of putting it. Like I feel like my intention with films is to kind of create a space for new conversations to be had, or like new pathways of thought to be grown or emerged out of. And I feel like intimacy and distance are quite a big part of that, or I'm quite interested in like this constructed separation between like a self and an other, and how what trying to bridge that might lead to, or like what kind of bridges, the way that you build these bridges between self and other, what kind of worlds might open up if we were to like walk across them, or kind of walk across them and then like jump off of them, or yeah. And I feel like maybe that ends up becoming like a, if it's a conversation, then it ends up with the two parties being quite, or like to juxtapose different kinds of things coming together, I guess. And seeing like what's, I don't know, in between in this space of things meeting.
Yeah. That's really interesting as well, because it makes me think about your process for making Tree as well, being like two, you know, physically separate words of like Utah and then like in the UK where you were at the time, sort of like coming together, and the different lenses of, you know, the scientific and the imagined sort of way of viewing things. Yeah, no, I think that's like definitely something that's really important, sort of bridging those gaps and doing so with like imagination and intimacy.
Yeah, and I think bridging those gaps are, I don't know, I think they're fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. So yeah, so in terms of like things progressing from previous works, are there any new projects that you're working on, and do you see these themes progressing in them as well?
Yeah, I'm currently doing a fellowship that's hosted between FACT Liverpool and Jerwood Arts. And it's me kind of dipping into more like interactive, new media, digital work, where I'm working with a programmer and some other collaborators to build a chatbot that's an interactive, so it's the first time I'm working with something that's interactive as well, which is quite different from making a film, which is more of a one-way dialogue. So it's a chatbot that's interactive, and yeah, I'm just laughing because I'm thinking again about all the different strands that I've combined. So when you speak to this chatbot via WhatsApp, you're also speaking to this character in this other world, and then their mission or their aim or their intention is to guide this kind of cosmic library of different wisdoms about like ancestry or like lineages that happen through generations. And this library has fallen into disuse. So this chatbot presence is reaching out to the user, being like, hey, I need help with my library. Would you be so kind as to just give me a hand? And so when you chat to them, the chatbot will ask you some questions, and what you respond then takes that conversation into a different direction. So maybe they'll say, do you only consider family as, like, biological family as part of your ancestry? And if you say yes, you're taking down a certain path. And if you say no, you're taking down a different path in this chatbot. But it all ends up to new material being formed for this library. And so, yeah, maybe this also echoes some of the themes you brought up in terms of distance. Like I feel like there's a question of distance between like the world of this chatbot and like the user that I'm trying to bridge, and seeing what common interests they might hold.
Yeah, you seem to have like a lot of interest in like imagining these like sort of different worlds and different kind of futures. Yeah, that's cool.
Thanks.
So we're going to open up for questions to the audience. We have a microphone in the audience, and if anyone has any questions, raise your hand and we'll try and get to you.
Having done the movie and the film and sat with it a while, would you have done, and looking at it retrospectively, would you have done anything different or changed anything? Or, you know, the idea of the connectivity between the trees, you know, and the communication with the trees, and then the discussion at the end, or the saying at the end about, you know, say hi to a tree, the more human element. Is there anything in that mix that you might have changed retrospectively?
Good question. I think the things I would change would maybe be more informed by like my understanding of like the climate crisis as it is today, and the ways that like, I mean, that was only made like last fall, so last autumn, less than a year ago, but a lot of things have already developed, and in a sense it feels both more dire but also more hopeful. I'm not really sure. So maybe in that nuance of the story, that tree would say there would be some shifts. Yeah. And to maybe pull more at the extremes of like the urgency, but also the way that like we're, you know, a decent amount of society is still mobilizing to trying to counteract it. So maybe there's giving a bit more credit to that. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just in a better mood today as well. But yeah.
Thank you. Hello. Just wondering about the writing process for the voice of Tree. Just wanted maybe if you could explain how you went about coming up with this narrative, in particularly in the way of transforming the dialogue that you had into a kind of personification, if you like, or into a voice, a singular voice.
Thank you for your question. I think the initial concept was quite intuitive to me. It was like, I think I knew I wanted to make something that like addressed ecological crisis, but like from the perspective of like a plant that is something that we don't really hear about so much, or, you know, a lot of it is framed in more like human-centered narratives of what we might lose and the things that might be destroyed. But I was just thinking about like, the amount of trauma or the weight that, say, a plant would carry, basically having seen like lots of their family, lots of their friends having perished in the lead up to things being the way they are now. So I thought a bit about that, and I was like, there are lots of ways to kind of like tell this story. What would be a nice way? And then I think, because sometimes I like to watch a lot of interviews on YouTube, and I was like, what if someone interviewed this like spirit from this specific tree, and like what they would say, and thinking also about the different kinds of like interests, I guess, that kind of platform holds. Like usually it comes in some kind of like funding interest or some kind of like media spectacle interest that to some extent provides like a context for this interview. It's not just an open space of dialogue where you can speak freely, but there are other things creating that space that are more invisible. And just thinking about how might that look like in an interview with this species? Like at first, they're still referring to them by their like assigned name or their like Latin name. And Tree's like, no, I don't want to be called that. And just seeing how they also kind of, I guess, subvert this like questioning or being questioned and having to respond power dynamic. So a bit around that, yeah.
Did it make you think about the kind of use of wood, for furniture and kind of what we actually do with it?
Yeah, there's a bit at the beginning that's like more collagey, or there's like lots of photos that are incredibly saturated and like overexposed, that are like pasted on top of each other. And for one of those scenes, it's like lots of human and plant interactions that I find really funny that I've like sourced around the internet. So there are like some really intense like hedges and like photos from like award-winning like hedge masters and stuff that I've used. That it's quite quick, so it's hard to catch. But I think that was kind of there as like drawing the history between plants and humans in this specific timeline that they exist on. So yeah, I did think a lot about like how humans, tend to approach nature as something that is like used or extracted or kind of made useful, and how actually maybe in this film, what Tree wants is for humans to be useful to them or for them for once.
Hi. I was wondering, how did you come up with setting in 2040, and did you kind of imagine a particular world and narrative around it to get to it? Or if you could just tell us a bit more about that.
I guess it's both quite random and kind of intentional. I, up until quite recently, maybe up until 2 years ago, found it quite hard to look into the future and be like, oh, this is what I'm going to be doing when I'm, say, 30, 40, 50, 60. And it felt like having that kind of foresight was something that I should have, but it was very hard to be I actually have no idea what I'm going to be doing then, what the world will look like, or what I will be wanting, where I will be living. All of these things are really open. And I think at one point I was like, okay, no, maybe I can just project some ideal version of me in year 2040 who is doing this and this thing. And then I think from there I drifted off into thinking about what's going to happen? If I really ride along the more climate doomy thoughts that I have sometimes, maybe the world will look like this, and maybe, but I'm sure there will still be gaps or glimmers of hope that exist, because that is never completely extinguished. So what might that look like in that year? So it's kind of a bit random, but then also more rooted in my own, I guess, personal conception of the future. Yeah.
Hi, I just wondered what the scientist you were working with and her colleagues and her students thought of it, and do they make use of it, and has it had any impact on the other side? Are they using it?
Yes, great question. Me and Alini had a really nice time working on it, actually, and I think she's told me both in private and during Q&As that she's really happy to have made this film, or to have contributed her scientific knowledge to this type of project that she's never really been encouraged to do before. So we're trying to make a program and find some funding, so if anyone knows anything, can hit me up. But we're trying to basically encourage more collaborations like this between artists and scientists, where people are, I think, encouraged to come together and make stuff, but not just in a way where art is just used as something to display or express or just translate a scientific understanding into something more creative, but for them to really be meeting and kind of combining it at the foundations a bit more. So I think that's one of the ways that it has kind of stemmed out a bit. We're currently kind of looking around for different places we can take this idea to. But she's also showed it to some of her colleagues at her university who I think similarly go on a similar journey to what she did. So at first they're kind of like, but that's not possible. You can't fuse these three trees. They're too far away from each other. But eventually they kind of get used to thinking about the fact like, okay, it's not about whether it's realistically possible or not, but about the fact that like allowing yourself to think beyond what is possible actually means that you can return to this reality with other kinds of information. So that's been quite fun to hear.
Hi, I was wondering if you can explain what was the visual process or the inspiration of the whole video. Like, was there any specific references by Dr. Nalini or by you, like that made you choose like a specific mood board, or like a choice of like the landscape shots or the frames, the angles, like the angles used, or even any vision for the artwork that you made? Yeah.
Weirdly enough, we actually never had a mood board, which I think is usually quite staple for the work I do now. But it felt more like, yeah, a lot of the stuff I was just building as I went along. But in terms of the frames, I was thinking a lot about kind of like headstones a bit, and just kind of this frame as like a containing device. And you usually think about things being stuck inside the frame, but then a lot of the text kind of spills out. And yeah, weirdly, actually, I think maybe the closest visual reference that I would use is like Studio Ghibli. But it's like not very Studio Ghibli at all. But I think the way that like those films, or like, films that are directed by Miyazaki maybe in particular, are just very good at building these kinds of worlds that really feel very emotional and very like relatable, but maybe I went a little bit weirder than Miyazaki does. But he's made some weird shit too, so I should give him more credit. Yeah. I'll have a think about that. Maybe I'll let you know.
Thank you. I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned like a few like personal things that kind of inspired this film, or like where you kind of went on a thought journey like through it, but I was wondering if you had also like personal experiences that kind of, or like what could more elaborate on like, yeah, kind of personal experiences that kind of really influenced that like film, because I think sometimes exactly this kind of artist, kind of scientist kind of collaboration can feel kind of distant from that personal, world, but like I do think this is still very kind of poetic and has a lot of it in it. Yeah, so I was wondering if you can elaborate on that.
For sure. In terms of this interest in like intergenerational trauma that Tree carries, I would say that's quite very much personal and something that's also quite present in other works, especially this chatbot project that I mentioned. And just thinking, maybe in the past 2 years, been thinking a bit more and doing a bit more research on my own like family history and the ways that, the things that they experience have also influenced me, whether that be on a more like socio-political, like more material level, or also like more emotionally or like psychologically, or just the ways that like dynamics kind of are reborn and like re-emerge as different forms later down the line. So I think that was quite a big part of it, and I think feels very important to me personally to kind of extend that kind of grace in terms of thinking about how both like violence or like resilience or whatever, patience, etc., these things are transmitted down generations, not just for humans and amongst like biological family for humans, but also like other than human types of beings as well, who also have to live their lives perhaps at different like time cycles than humans do, but also transmit their knowledge and evolve a certain type of knowledge that continues to develop as time passes, which I don't think is very different from what humans do.
Hi, can you join me in saying thank you to our panelists? Thank you both. Yeah, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed that, and hope to see you again, either next year or at one of the other screenings. Yep, and again, thanks to Nottingham Contemporary for hosting us. Thanks.